The wind
You have to
howled
leave
like
now.
a dying
It's not
beast,
safe.
tearing
But what
through the
about
canyons
you?
of the
I'll
Wyoming
hold them off.
territory.
Go!
Be careful!
It was a brutal, unforgiving winter, the kind that froze a man's breath in his throat before he could even curse the cold. Snow fell in sheets, a white curtain that obliterated the horizon and turned the world into a featureless void. Through this white hell, a single rider pushed forward. His name was Garrett Thorne. He was a man etched from the same granite as the mountains he traversed, his face hidden beneath the brim of a battered Stetson and a thick wool scarf. His coat was heavy buffalo hide, dusted white, and his horse, a massive roan named Boulder, plodded along with its head low, fighting the drifts that reached its knees. Garrett wasn't out here for pleasure. He was checking the fence line of the sprawling, empty acres he called home. He was a man who preferred the silence of the high country to the chatter of townsfolk. He had no kin, no debts, and no one waiting for him to return. As dusk began to bleed the sky into a bruised purple, Garrett squinted against the biting sleet. He was miles from his cabin, and the temperature was dropping fast. He needed to find shelter or turn back, but a shape in the snow caught his eye. It was unnatural, a disruption in the smooth, wind-sculpted drifts. It looked like a discarded pile of colorful silk, stark against the blinding white. He steered Boulder toward the object, his hand instinctively drifting to the rifle in his scabbard. Out here, traps were common, and mercy was rare. But as he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a trap. It was people. Two of them, huddled together for warmth. Garrett swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching heavily into the frozen crust. He approached cautiously, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. The figures were small, curled into a tight ball, half buried in the accumulating snow. He brushed the powder away and felt his heart skip a beat. They were women, identical in every feature. They were dressed in layers of strange, vibrant fabric, silks and embroidered cotton that offered no protection against a Wyoming winter. Their skin was pale, tinged with the blue of hypothermia, and their hair, black as a raven's wing, was matted with ice. "Easy now," Garrett muttered, more to himself than to them. He pulled off his glove and pressed 2 fingers to the neck of the nearest woman. A pulse, faint, thready, but there. He checked the other. The same. They were alive, but only just. He didn't waste time looking for tracks or wondering how 2 women dressed for a spring festival in the Orient ended up freezing to death in the American Rockies. He scooped one of them up. She was terrifyingly light, like a bird with hollow bones. He felt the cold radiating off her, a deep, settling chill that meant she was close to the end. Mounting the horse was a struggle, but he managed, settling her in front of him. He looked at the second woman, still curled in the snow. Leaving her was not an option. With a grunt of exertion, he dismounted, helped the first woman stay seated, and lifted her sister. Mounting Boulder with the second woman was a monumental struggle, but Garrett was strong, his muscles hardened by years of solitary labor. He situated them both in the saddle, one in front and one behind, wrapping his buffalo coat around them as best he could, shielding their faces from the wind with his own body. "Hold on," he growled into the gale. "Don't you die on me now. Not out here." The ride back to the cabin was a blur of endurance. Boulder seemed to sense the urgency, finding footing where there should have been none. When the dark outline of the cabin finally appeared through the swirling snow, Garrett felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. He kicked the door open, carrying the women inside one by one. The cabin was cold, the fire having died down to embers hours ago, but it was a sanctuary compared to the storm outside. He laid them on his narrow bed, side by side, moving with a frantic efficiency. He stoked the fire, feeding it dry cedar until the flames roared and popped, casting a golden glow across the rough-hewn logs of the walls. He knew he had to get them warm, but not too fast. He removed their frozen outer garments, his rough hands fumbling with the delicate silk knots and clasps. Underneath, they wore simple cotton linens. He grabbed every quilt and blanket he owned, heavy wool things that smelled of wood smoke and tobacco, and piled them over the 2 still forms. He heated water in a cast-iron kettle, tearing a strip of clean cloth to gently wipe the frost from their faces. For 3 days, the storm raged outside, burying the cabin up to the windows in snow. And for 3 days, the women drifted in the borderlands between life and death. Garrett barely slept. He sat in the rocking chair by the fire, watching their chests rise and fall in unison, feeding the flames and spooning warm broth between their lips whenever they stirred. He learned the landscape of their faces in the firelight. They were identical, young, perhaps 25, with high cheekbones and mouths that seemed set in a line of determination even in sleep. They were beautiful in a way that made Garrett's chest ache with a familiar, hollow loneliness he usually kept buried deep. On the 4th morning, the wind died. The silence that followed was deafening. Sunlight, sharp and brilliant, poured through the frosted window pane. Garrett was dozing in the chair, his chin on his chest, when a sound woke him. Water. It was a whisper, dry and cracked, but distinct. Garrett jerked awake. One of the women was looking at him. Her eyes were dark, almond-shaped, and filled with confusion. But the glaze of death was gone. As he moved, her sister stirred, her own eyes fluttering open. He was at their side in an instant, lifting a tin cup to the first woman's lips. "Slow," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Don't choke." She drank greedily, her hands trembling as they came up to hold the cup. When it was empty, she let her head fall back against the pillow, her identical sister watching him with the same searching gaze. They didn't look afraid, which surprised him. Most folks found Garrett Thorne intimidating, a towering, bearded man with eyes like flint. Where is this?" the second woman asked. Her English was accented, the vowels clipped and precise, but clear. "Wyoming Territory," Garrett said, stepping back to give them space. "My ranch. Found you in the snow about 5 miles east of the pass." You were half frozen. They shared a look, a silent communication passing between them. A shadow of pain crossed their faces. "The wagon," the first one whispered. "The wheel broke," the second one continued. "The men," they argued. "We ran." Garrett didn't press them. He knew enough about the world to know that 2 women alone, especially 2 Chinese women in the West, faced dangers that made the blizzard seem kind. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Name's Garrett." Garrett Thorne. The women looked at him again, their gazes searching his face, looking for deception. Whatever they saw seemed to satisfy them. "I am Mai," said the first. "And I am Lian," said the second. "Mai and Lian," he repeated, the names feeling strange and delicate on his tongue. "Well, Mai, Lian, you rest. You've got a ways to go before you're walking." Recovery was slow. For the next week, Mai and Lian were confined to the bed, their strength returning in increments. Garrett continued his routine, chores in the morning, tending to the livestock, then returning to the cabin to cook and care for them. The dynamic in the small cabin shifted. For years, Garrett had lived in a silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind. Now there were 2 presences. The soft rustle of blankets, the sound of their breathing in sync, the clink of the spoon against the bowl, twice over. It was unsettling at first, an intrusion on his solitude. But soon it became something he found himself anticipating as he trudged through the snow to the barn. As Mai and Lian grew stronger, they began to assert themselves. It started with the food. Garrett was a man who ate to survive: beans, jerky, hardtack, and flavorless stew. One evening, he came in from chopping wood to find Mai and Lian sitting by the hearth. Lian was dropping dried herbs from his own pantry into the pot, herbs he hadn't known what to do with, while Mai stirred. "What are you doing?" he asked, stomping the snow off his boots. Mai looked up, a hint of a smile on her face. "Your stew," she said. "It has no soul," Lian added, "it tastes like sadness and old leather." "We are fixing it," Garrett blinked, taken aback. "Sadness and old leather." "Sit," Mai commanded, gesturing to the table. He sat. When Lian placed the bowl in front of him, the aroma hit him first. Sage, wild onion, and something else, something warm and spicy. He took a bite. It was the best thing he had eaten in 10 years. He looked at them, and they offered small, triumphant smiles in unison. Better, they asked. Better, he admitted, scraping the bowl clean. From that day on, Mai and Lian took charge of the cabin's interior. As soon as they could stand, they were sweeping the dust that had settled in the corners for years. They found a needle and thread in his haphazard supplies and mended the tears in his spare shirts. They organized his pantry, scrubbed the soot from the windows, and even braided a rug from scraps of old fabric to place by the door. Garrett watched this transformation with a mix of awe and trepidation. The cabin, once just a shelter against the elements, was becoming a home. But the fear lingered in the back of his mind. The snow would melt. The pass would open, and they would leave. Why wouldn't they? They were young, vibrant, and he was just a weathered rancher living at the edge of the world. One evening, about 3 weeks after he found them, another storm rolled in. It wasn't as fierce as the first, but it howled with a melancholy tone, rattling the door on its hinges. They sat by the fire, Garrett oiling his bridle leather, Mai and Lian sewing buttons onto his heavy coat with practiced efficiency. "You never asked why we ran," Mai said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Garrett paused, the rag hovering over the leather. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. A man's past is his own business." "Reckon a woman's is the same." Lian set the coat down, both sisters looking into the flames. The firelight danced in their dark eyes. "We were promised to a man in San Francisco," Lian explained. "A merchant. He paid our father's debts in Canton, so we were the payment," Mai continued, speaking matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "We arrived in America and we saw him. He was cruel. His eyes were like ice. We knew if we went with him, our spirits would die. So when they transported us east to his mining interests, we ran." Garrett looked at them, seeing the steel beneath the silk. "That took guts," he said softly. "Running into a blizzard, better to freeze free than live in a cage," Mai said. She turned to him, her sister's gaze following. "And you, Garrett Thorne? Why are you alone in this white wasteland? You are not a cruel man. You are strong. You have land." Garrett sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone. Had a wife once. Annabelle. And a little girl. The words felt jagged in his throat. Influenza took them both 5 years back. Just a bad winter like this one. Couldn't get a doctor in time. He stared at his hands, rough and scarred. After that, well, the house felt too big. The town felt too loud. Came out here. Just seemed easier to be alone than to see them missing from every corner of the room. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding of loss. Lian reached out, placing her small hand over his large, calloused one. Her skin was warm. Mai placed her hand over her sister's. "Sorrow is a heavy coat," Lian whispered. "But you cannot wear it forever," Mai added. "Eventually, the sun comes out and it becomes too hot to carry." Garrett looked at their hands, then up to their faces. For the first time, he let himself really look at them, not as victims he saved, but as women. "Maybe," he grunted, pulling his hand away gently to resume his work, terrified of the hope flaring in his chest. Weeks passed. The deep freeze of winter began to loosen its grip. Icicles dripped from the eaves, and patches of brown earth began to show through the white blanket of the valley. The time for departure was drawing near. Garrett became moody. He spent longer hours out on the range, riding fences that didn't need fixing, hunting game they didn't need. He was preparing himself for the return to silence. He told himself it was for the best. What kind of life could he offer them here? Hard work, isolation, and the ghosts of his past. They deserved better. They deserved a life in a city with people of their own kind, with comforts he couldn't provide. One evening, he came back to the cabin late. The sun had already set, and the air was crisp. He walked in expecting to see them packing or perhaps asking when he could take them to the nearest train depot. Instead, the cabin was warm, filled with the smell of roasting venison. Mai and Lian were standing by the table, which was set for 3. They had found an old tablecloth he'd forgotten he owned, one Annabelle had used on Sundays. They had even placed a jar of pine sprigs in the center. Garrett stopped at the door, knocking the mud from his boots. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice gruff to hide the ache in his heart. "Dinner," they said in unison. "Sit." He washed his hands in the basin and Saturday. They ate in silence, but the air was charged with unspoken words. Garrett pushed his food around his plate, his appetite gone. "Snow's clearing," he said finally. The words tasted like ash. "Pass should be open in a day or two. I can saddle Boulder up. Take you down to Lamy. Put you on a train to wherever you want to go. San Francisco, maybe. Or back east." Maya and Leanne stopped eating. They placed their forks down with a deliberate click. "Is that what you want, Garrett?" Maya asked. "To send us away?" Garrett looked up, his jaw tight. "Ain't about what I want. It's about what's right. This ain't no life for women like you. Stuck out here in the middle of nowhere with a grump of a rancher. You got your whole lives ahead of you. No debts now. You're free, Leanne repeated, testing the word. They stood up and walked around the table. They moved with a grace that made the rough cabin floor seem like a ballroom, stopping on either side of his chair. "We have listened to you, Garrett," Mai said softly. "When you think we are asleep, you talk to the fire. You complain about the buttons missing on your shirts. You complain that the silence is too loud. You complain that the townspeople look at you with pity," Leanne added. Garrett's face heated. He hadn't realized they'd been listening to his late-night mutterings. I just talk to hear myself think sometimes. Don't mean nothing by it." They leaned in closer, their hands resting on his shoulders. The scent of them, soap and sage, filled his senses. "Last week when you went to town for supplies," Leanne continued, "you came back angry. You said the baker's wife, Mrs. Gable, tried to set you up with her niece again. You told the horse, Boulder, they all think I need a wife, but they don't know me." Garrett looked down, ashamed. "Mrs. Gable is a busybody. Doesn't know when to quit." Mai gently turned his head to face her, while Leanne kept her hand on his other shoulder. They looked down at him, their identical eyes shining with a mixture of amusement and fierce affection. "You need help here, Garrett," Mai said. "You work too hard. Your cooking is terrible. Your house needs a woman's hand," Leanne continued. "And your heart," Mai touched his chest right over his beating heart. "Your heart is lonely." Garrett swallowed hard, unable to look away from their gaze. "I manage," he choked out. They smiled. A slow, confident curve of their lips that made his breath catch. They leaned down, their faces inches from his, their voices dropping to a whisper that echoed louder than any shout in the canyon. "I heard you want a wife," Mai said, her eyes locking onto his. Leanne finished the thought, her voice just as clear, just as certain. "We are perfect for you." The words hung in the air, bold and undeniable. Garrett stared at them, stunned. He looked from one face to the other, searching for a joke, a trick, but found only sincerity and a strength that matched his own. "My Leanne," he stammered. I'm a widower. I'm older than you. I ain't rich. I got nothing but this land and a lot of hard work." "We do not want rich," Leanne said firmly. "We want safe. We want kind. We want a man who rides into a blizzard to save strangers," Mai added. "We want a home where we are not sold, but where we choose to stay." They each took one of his rough hands in theirs. "We choose this," they said together. "We choose you." Garrett felt the walls he had built around his heart crumbling stone by stone. He stood up slowly, towering over them, yet feeling like they were the ones holding him up. "You really mean that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "You'd both stay here with me?" "We are not going anywhere, Garrett Thorne," Mai said. "Unless you throw us out in the snow again," Leanne added with a glimmer in her eye. A laugh bubbled up in his chest, a sound he hadn't heard in years. It was rusty and deep. "Not a chance," he said. "You'd freeze before you got to the gate." He reached out, his hands hesitating for a moment before cupping their faces. Their skin was soft, a stark contrast to his calloused palms. He leaned down and kissed Mai, then Lian. They were tentative at first, questions asked and answered. Then they grew deeper, filled with the promise of spring after a long, hard winter. The next morning, the sun rose over a world that looked different. The snow was still there, blinding white and deep, but the isolation was gone. They didn't wait for a preacher. The nearest one was a 3-day ride, and the snow was still too deep for travel. Instead, that evening they stood on the porch of the cabin, the vast, star-strewn sky their cathedral. The coyotes yipped in the distance, a wild choir witnessing their vows. Garrett held Mai's and Lian's hands. "I promise to keep you safe," he said, his voice steady and sure, looking from one to the other. "To honor you, to never let you be cold again." Mai and Lian squeezed his hands. "And we promise to keep your heart warm," Lian replied. "To fill this house with life," Mai finished, "and to never let you eat flavorless stew again." Garrett chuckled, sliding a simple ring onto Mai's finger, then an identical one onto Lian's, bands of polished silver he had fashioned from coins in the workshop that afternoon. They weren't fancy, but they shone in the moonlight. "I reckon that's a fair trade," he said. Life on the ranch changed. It wasn't easy. The West was never easy. There were droughts and blizzards, lean years and wolves. But the silence was gone. The cabin was filled with the scent of spices Mai and Lian ordered from San Francisco, mixing with the smell of pine and leather. They proved to be more than just housekeepers. They were partners. They learned to ride as well as any cowhand, their balance perfect, their hands gentle on the reins. They helped with the carving in the spring and the harvest in the fall. They brought a keen, shared mind to the ranch's books, finding ways to save money and trade smarter. Travelers passing through the territory began to talk about the Thorn Ranch. They spoke of the strange, beautiful garden that bloomed behind the cabin, where vegetables from the Orient grew alongside hardy Wyoming potatoes. They spoke of the hospitality, of the best meals to be found west of the Mississippi. But mostly they spoke of the family who lived there, the towering, graying rancher and his 2 petite, fierce, identical wives. They said you could see it in the way they looked at each other, a quiet, unshakable bond. Years later, on a winter evening much like the one where they met, Garrett sat in his rocking chair. His hair was white now, and his joints ached when the pressure dropped. The fire roared in the hearth. Mai and Lian sat opposite him, mending a shirt for their youngest son, who was asleep in the loft. They looked up, catching his eye. The years had etched lines on their faces, but their eyes were as sharp and dark as ever. "What are you staring at, old man?" they teased gently, in unison. Garrett smiled, the expression easy and worn into his face. "Just thinking," he said. "About that blizzard." Mai and Lian paused, a soft, shared smile touching their lips. "A cold day," Lian said. "The coldest," Garrett agreed.